I could feel the tension in the air even before the first rumble of thunder echoed through the valley. Willow Creek, nestled deep within the wilderness, was isolated on the best of days. It was the kind of place you went when you wanted to disappear from the world for a while. I had rented the cabin for a week, hoping to escape the chaos of city life. What I found instead was something much darker. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it hiking along the creek that gave the place its name, enjoying the crisp mountain air. By late afternoon, I noticed the sky growing heavy with dark clouds, an ominous sign of what was to come. I wasn't concerned at first. A thunderstorm in the mountains wasn't anything new, and the idea of watching it from the safety of the cabin felt comforting. Little did I know that safety was only an illusion. By evening, the storm hit. At first, it was the usual sound of rain tapping against the roof, but within minutes, it turned into a torrential downpour. Thunder boomed like the earth was splitting in two, and the wind howled, shaking the cabin as if it was made of paper. I lit a fire, hoping the crackle of the flames would drown out the chaos outside. It didn't help. Around midnight, the storm was at its peak. The power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. I was left with only the dim light of the fire and the faint glow of my flashlight. The sound of rain hammering the windows was relentless, and every crash of thunder seemed closer than the last. I tried to calm myself, but there was something about the storm that felt wrong. It wasn't just the intensity, it was the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was my imagination. The isolation of the cabin, the darkness, and the storm were playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it, a knock at the door. My heart stopped. There was no one for miles, I was certain of that. The nearest town was a good 20-minute drive, and I hadn't seen anyone since arriving. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight and cautiously approached the door, my heart racing. I peered through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. No shape, no figure, just the storm raging outside. Another knock. This time, it was so forceful it rattled the door. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking who it was. No answer, just the sound of rain and thunder. I backed away, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was an animal, but no animal would knock. Another knock, and this time it was accompanied by a low, guttural voice. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was barely audible over the storm, but I knew I had heard it. It wasn't human. There was something primal about the way it sounded, like an animal trying to mimic speech. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I backed away from the door. I had no intention of opening it, but I felt trapped. The storm outside was too dangerous to run into, and whatever was out there, knocking on my door, wasn't going to leave easily. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see outside. The rain was pouring so heavily I could barely make out the trees, but something caught my eye. Standing just beyond the porch was a figure, tall and hunched. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the cabin. Another knock. This time it wasn't on the door. It came from the window. I jumped back, dropping the flashlight in my panic. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the room. The knock came again, more insistent. I backed into the corner, my mind racing. What was out there? And why was it trying to get in? Suddenly, the fire died down, leaving the room in almost total darkness. The only light now came from the sporadic flashes of lightning that illuminated the cabin for split seconds at a time. I could hear footsteps now, circling the cabin. Whatever it wasn't in a hurry. It was playing with me, letting me know it was there, and that I was trapped. Another knock, this time from the back door. Then the voice again, louder. "Let me in." I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. The storm had knocked out everything. I was on my own. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Then, without warning, the door rattled violently, as if someone, or something, was trying to break it down. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a fire poker, and braced myself. The door continued to shake, the wood groaning under the pressure. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Just as I prepared for the worst, the storm seemed to intensify. The wind howling so loudly it drowned out everything else. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The door stopped rattling, and the footsteps disappeared. I stood there shaking, fire poker in hand, waiting for whatever was outside to make its next move. But nothing happened. For what felt like hours, I stood in silence, listening to the storm rage on. Finally, I worked up the courage to approach the window again. I slowly pulled back the curtain and looked out. There was no figure, no shadowy presence. Just the storm, still battering the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in front of the fire, the poker still in my hand, waiting for the knocking to start again. But it never did. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily calm. I stepped onto the porch, the air fresh and still damp from the rain. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone, or anything, had been there. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. I packed up and left that afternoon, cutting my trip short. As I drove away from Willow Creek, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had knocked on my door that night hadn't gone far. It was still out there, waiting for the next storm to roll in. There's something about thunderstorms in the mountains that chills you to your core. The rolling thunder, the jagged bolts of lightning tearing through the sky, and the way the rain lashed down, like it's trying to wash everything away. I had never felt more exposed than I did during that summer at Hollow Peak. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a chance to escape the grind of city life. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. I had been looking forward to my stay at the old cabin for months. It sat at the edge of a lake, surrounded by thick pine forests, miles away from the nearest town. I loved the idea of disconnecting from the world, trading in the constant buzz of my phone for the quiet stillness of nature. But the isolation that had once seemed so appealing quickly turned into a nightmare when the weather took a sudden turn. It was the second night when the storm hit. I had spent the day hiking through the woods, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sky had grown dark, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. I barely had time to settle in before the first bolt of lightning lit up the sky, followed by the deafening crack of thunder. I had seen storms before, but nothing like this. The wind howled through the trees, making them sway and groan like living things, and the rain fell in sheets, pounding against the cabin roof. I tried to make the best of it, lighting a fire and settling down with a book. But it was impossible to relax. The storm was too loud, too violent. Every flash of lightning sent shadows dancing across the walls, and the thunder seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. Still, I tried to push the unease aside. After all, It was just a storm. I'd weathered plenty of them before. Then the knocking started. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the shutters. But after the third knock, I knew it was something else. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone, or something, was outside. My heart began to race as I listened, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the knock came again, louder this time. I stood frozen, staring at the door. There was no reason anyone should be out here in the middle of a storm like this. I was the only one for miles. Another knock, followed by a voice. "Let me in." It was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The voice was strange, distorted, like it was coming from deep within a well. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Maybe it was a hiker, lost in the storm, needing shelter. But something about that voice wasn't right. It was too cold. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. The fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows across the room as I reached the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the lock. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I had to know. I had to see who, or what, was out there. Slowly, I pulled back the curtain on the window next to the door and peered out. My breath caught in my throat. There was no one there. Just the storm, raging against the cabin. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. Maybe it had just been the wind after all. But then the knock came again, and the voice, more insistent this time. "Let me in." I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the lock, throwing the door open. The wind rushed in, nearly knocking me off my feet, but there was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the darkness. Rain lashed at my face, and the wind howled, but the porch was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Just the storm and the thick darkness of the forest beyond. I backed into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe I was losing it. The isolation, the storm, it was all getting to me. But then the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I froze, staring at the door. The voice was coming from the other side. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they were still out there. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a person. The knocking started again, louder now, more insistent. The voice followed, cold and demanding. "Let me in." I stumbled back toward the fire, grabbing the poker from the hearth. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, but I knew I couldn't let it in. Whatever it wasn't human. The knocking stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the storm. Then, without warning, the back door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way in. I spun around, the poker clutched tightly in my hand, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice came again, this time from the back door. "Let me in." It was closer now, more urgent. I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But where would I go? The storm outside was brutal, and the nearest town was miles away. Suddenly, the fire flickered, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only light now came from the sporadic flashes of lightning, casting eerie shadows across the room. I could hear the wind howling outside, but the knocking had stopped. The voice was gone. I stood there, trembling in the darkness, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, then an hour, but the knocking didn't return. Eventually, the storm began to die down, and the wind subsided. I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted and terrified, my mind still reeling from the events of the night. The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the lake. The storm was over, but the terror remained. I packed my things and left the cabin that day, swearing never to return to Hollow Peak. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone watching me from the edge of the forest. But there was nothing, just the quiet, peaceful woods. But I knew better. I knew that whatever had knocked on my door that night was still out there, waiting for the next storm to come. Growing up in the small town of Grey Ridge, storms were part of the landscape, especially in the summer. You could always count on two things: sweltering heat during the day and violent thunderstorms rolling in by evening. As kids, we'd watch the lightning crack across the sky from our windows and feel the house shake with every boom of thunder. But there was one storm I'll never forget, because that's when it came. It was late August, and the heat had been relentless for weeks. The air was thick and sticky, making it impossible to breathe, let alone sleep. My wife, Samantha, and I had moved into our new farmhouse just outside town, thinking it would be the perfect retreat from city life. We wanted the peace and quiet of rural living, where we could raise our kids one day, surrounded by nature. But nature had other plans that night. That evening, the weather forecast was grim, torrential rain, high winds, the works. We had experienced countless storms since moving in, but this one felt different. The air was oppressive, and the wind had picked up long before the rain arrived. Even the animals seemed on edge. Our dog, Max, wouldn't leave the porch, and the chickens clucked nervously in their coop. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as if the world itself was holding its breath. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book, when the first crack of thunder shook the house. It was so loud I jumped, dropping the book to the floor. Samantha glanced up from her crossword puzzle, her eyes wide. "That was close," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain that had started to pelt the windows. "Yeah, that one was right on top of us," I muttered, bending to pick up the book. "We should probably check the basement windows before the rain gets any worse." We were still getting used to the quirks of the old farmhouse. The place had been built in the early 1900s and had all the charm and problems you'd expect from a house that old. Creaky floors, drafty windows, and a basement that flooded if you so much as looked at it wrong. I stood up and headed toward the kitchen to grab a flashlight. The power had flickered a few times already, and I didn't trust it to last through the storm. As I rummaged through the junk drawer, a loud bang echoed through the house. It was the front door. Samantha and I exchanged confused glances. I set the flashlight down, and we both moved toward the door. Max was already there, growling low in his throat, his fur standing on end. "Who the hell is out here in this storm?" I muttered under my breath. We lived far enough from town that visitors were rare, and showing up unannounced during a thunderstorm was practically unheard of. The wind howled outside, rattling the door in its frame. Rain slashed against the windows in sheets, and another bolt of lightning illuminated the yard. I couldn't see anyone standing on the porch, but the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I grabbed the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Samantha stood beside me, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to ward off a chill. "Be careful," she whispered. I nodded and pulled the door open. The wind nearly ripped it from my hands, and rain immediately started to pour into the entryway. I squinted against the downpour, stepping out onto the porch, but there was no one there. Just the storm, raging in the darkness. Max followed me, barking wildly into the night, but I didn't see anything. No figure, no car, not even footprints. "Hello," I called out, hoping to hear a voice or see a light through the sheets of rain. Nothing. I stepped back inside, slamming the door shut against the wind. Was it just the wind? Samantha asked, her voice tight. I guess. But it sounded too much like someone knocking. I wiped the rain from my face and locked the door behind me. The storm intensified over the next hour. The lightning came in rapid bursts, followed by deafening claps of thunder that made the house tremble. Max refused to leave the front door, growling softly at something only he could sense. I tried to focus on my book again, but every crack of thunder set my nerves on edge. Then, there was another knock, 3 loud, deliberate bangs on the front door. Samantha gasped, and Max went berserk, barking and clawing at the door like he was ready to rip through it. "I'll get it," I muttered, standing up, my pulse racing. I didn't want to open that door. Something deep in my gut screamed at me not to, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the door, Max at my heels. I could hear Samantha's footsteps behind me, hesitant and uncertain. "Maybe we should just ignore it," she whispered, but I was already at the door. I turned the knob and pulled it open, bracing myself against the wind and rain. And again, no one was there. The porch was empty, just as it had been the first time. But something felt wrong. The air was colder now, colder than it should have been for an August night, even in the middle of a storm. I shined the flashlight out into the yard, sweeping it across the rain-soaked landscape. The beam caught something, a flash of movement near the edge of the woods. My heart skipped a beat, and I stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the darkness. "Samantha, did you see that?" I called back into the house, but I didn't wait for an answer. I moved off the porch and into the yard, the rain instantly soaking through my clothes. Max barked and darted ahead of me, his growl low and menacing. The wind whipped through the trees, and the thunder seemed to shake the ground beneath my feet. I kept the flashlight trained on the spot where I'd seen the movement, but the figure, or whatever it was, had disappeared into the woods. I stopped at the tree line, peering into the dense forest. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I called for Max, but he had already disappeared into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, the rain stinging my skin as I considered going after him. But every instinct told me to turn back, to get back to the safety of the house. Instead, I took a step forward, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness of the trees. "Max," I called again, my voice barely audible over the storm. No response. I took another step, my heart racing. The air was thick with tension, and the sense of dread grew stronger with each passing second. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard a noise, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't Max. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The growl came again, closer this time, and I knew I had made a mistake. I turned and ran, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I sprinted back toward the house. The storm raged around me, the thunder cracking overhead, and the rain blinding me as I ran. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind me and locking it tight. Samantha rushed to my side, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I panted, "but something's out there." We stood in the entryway, the storm howling outside, and Max still nowhere to be found. My heart sank as I realized I had left him out there, but I couldn't go back. Not after what I'd heard. The knocking came again, louder this time, more forceful. And then the voice, a low, raspy whisper, drifted through the door. "Let me in," Samantha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, my knuckles white as I gripped it tightly. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't," I muttered, backing away from the door. The voice came again, more insistent. "Let me in." I shook my head, stepping back toward the living room. I didn't know what was outside, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't letting it in. We huddled together on the couch, the storm raging around us, the knocking growing louder and more frantic. The voice echoed through the house, relentless and terrifying. It was a long night, but as the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the knocking stopped. The voice was gone, and Max, somehow, had found his way back to the porch, drenched but unharmed. We never found out what was knocking on our door that night, but we moved shortly after, and I've never set foot in Hollow Peak again. Living in the Midwest, thunderstorms were nothing new to me. They were as frequent as the morning dew and as commonplace as the chirping cicadas at night. But there was one storm, one night, that shattered the tranquility of those familiar summer tempests. It was a storm so intense that it did not just shake the skies. It stirred something far more dangerous. It started as an ordinary day. The weather had been stifling all week, and everyone in town was talking about the coming storm. My fiancée, Lily, and I lived in an old farmhouse that had been in my family for generations. It was located on a large plot of land, surrounded by open fields and bordered by thick woods. The house was sturdy, built to withstand the harshest weather, but it had its quirks: creaky floors, an attic that always seemed colder than the rest of the house, and a basement that occasionally flooded during heavy rains. That afternoon, the sky had taken on a peculiar, almost sickly hue. It was the kind of yellowish green that sent shivers down your spine, a telltale sign that the storm would be fierce. The wind picked up gradually, causing the trees to sway like dancers in slow motion. By the time the sun began to set, we could hear the distant rumble of thunder. The storm was getting closer. I was on the porch, hammering down a few loose boards, trying to get everything secured before the storm hit. Lily came out, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the horizon nervously. "You think it'll be bad?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Could be," I replied, wiping the sweat from my brow. "But this house has been through worse." She smiled weakly but didn't look convinced. Thunderstorms had always made her uneasy, but this one had her particularly on edge. There was something unsettling about the air, something that even I, a seasoned farmer who had weathered countless storms, couldn't shake. By the time we finished dinner, the rain had started, a light drizzle at first, but it quickly intensified. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the first flash of lightning illuminated the sky. It wasn't long before the storm was right on top of us. Lily and I sat in the living room, trying to ignore the growing ferocity of the storm. We had lit a few candles in case the power went out, which was common in these old farmhouses. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind roared through the trees, making it sound like a freight train was barreling through our yard. Suddenly, there was a loud crack of thunder, followed by an even louder bang. The entire house seemed to shudder with the force of it. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. Lily gasped, her grip tightening on my arm. That was close. I grabbed the flashlight from the side table and switched it on, casting an eerie glow around the room. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's check the breaker." The electrical panel was in the basement, of course. The one place in the house I always hated going during storms. It had a dank, musty smell, and the concrete walls were always damp, no matter how dry the weather had been. I grabbed a lantern and made my way down the narrow staircase, Lily following close behind. As we descended into the basement, the air grew colder, almost unnaturally so. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, scanning the room with the flashlight. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp with the flickering light, making the room feel smaller than it was. "There's the panel," I muttered, more to myself than to Lily, as I made my way across the room. I reached for the breaker, flipping the main switch, but nothing happened. The power remained stubbornly out. I frowned, flicking it back and forth a few more times, but still nothing. "I guess the storm's knocked out the whole grid," I said, turning to Lily, who was standing by the stairs, her arms wrapped around herself. "That's not good," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What do we do?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "We'll just have to wait it out. The power company should have it back up by morning." As we turned to head back upstairs, there was a sudden bang from behind us. We both froze, turning slowly to face the direction of the noise. The flashlight beam flickered across the room, landing on a stack of old crates. One of them had been knocked over, spilling its contents onto the floor. "What the hell?" I muttered, stepping forward cautiously. I hadn't seen anything move. It was as if the crate had fallen on its own. The basement was cold and damp, but there was no wine down here, nothing that could have knocked it over. I scanned the room again, but there was no one there. "Let's get out of here," Lily said, her voice urgent. I nodded in agreement, and we hurried back upstairs, shutting the basement door firmly behind us. The storm was still raging outside, but the house felt quieter now, the howling wind muffled by the thick walls. We sat back down in the living room, trying to ignore the growing tension in the air. The candles cast long shadows across the walls, and the storm seemed to grow even more violent. The thunder was constant now, each boom rattling the windows, and the lightning flashed so frequently that it felt like a strobe light. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but as it continued, it grew louder, more insistent. 3 sharp knocks, coming from the front door. Lily and I exchanged a look. Who would be out here in this storm? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and no one in their right mind would be traveling in this weather. "I'll go check," I said, standing up and grabbing the flashlight. Lily followed me to the door, her face pale with fear. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and pulling it open. The wind immediately whipped through the house, blowing out 2 of the candles and sending rain splashing across the floor. But there was no one there. I shone the flashlight out into the yard, but all I could see was the rain, coming down in sheets. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. but there was no sign of anyone outside. "Hello," I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. I shut the door and locked it again, turning to face Lily. "It must have been the wind," I said, though even I didn't believe it. She nodded, but her eyes were wide with fear. We returned to the living room, but the sense of unease had only grown stronger. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if whatever was out there was growing more impatient. This time, I didn't bother opening the door. I knew there was no one out there. But that didn't make the knocking any less real. "What's happening?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, gripping the flashlight tightly. "But something's not right." The knocking continued, relentless and unyielding. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind and rain outside. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained still. The storm outside seemed to be weakening, the thunder growing more distant. Just when I thought it was over, there was a loud crash from upstairs. Lily and I both jumped to our feet, our hearts pounding in our chests. The crash had come from the guest bedroom, the room we never used. I grabbed the flashlight and headed up the stairs, Lily following close behind. The hallway was dark, the air thick with tension. I pushed open the door to the guest room, shining the flashlight inside. The window was wide open, rain pouring in and soaking the floor. I approached the window cautiously, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the mud below. No evidence that anyone had been there at all. I shut the window and turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it, whispering. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. It was coming from the closet. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, my heart racing. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I slowly turned toward the closet, raising the flashlight. "Don't," Lily whispered, but it was too late. I pulled open the closet door, and the whispering stopped. The closet was empty, or at least it should have been. There, in the back of the closet, was a small, hidden door. It was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, and I had never noticed it before. My hand shook as I reached for the door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Lily stood behind me, her eyes wide with terror. "What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I pulled open the door, revealing a small, dark space beyond. The smell that hit me was foul, like something long dead and decaying. I shone the flashlight into the space, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. Then I saw it, a figure crouched in the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the light. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. "What did you see?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I whispered, backing away from the closet. "But we need to get out of here." We hurried back downstairs, grabbing our coats and keys. The storm had lessened, but the tension in the air had only grown stronger. As we stepped outside, I could feel eyes watching us from the house, from the woods, from the shadows. We never went back to that house. The next day, we packed what little we could and left, selling the farmhouse to a bear who didn't ask any questions. But sometimes, when the storms roll in and the thunder shakes the sky, I think about that night. About the hidden door, about the figure in the closet, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting. It was a quiet afternoon when I got the call. My friend, David, had inherited his grandparents' property deep in the Black Creek Canyon, a secluded area that most people in town avoided. I had never been out there myself, but I'd heard the rumors. Old folks whispered about strange occurrences in the canyon, bizarre lights, unnatural sounds during storms, and people going missing in the deep woods. David, though, had brushed off the stories. To him, it was just an old family home, a fixer-upper he was determined to renovate and live in. David invited me to stay with him for a week. He needed help with repairs, and honestly, I was curious about the place. I agreed, packed my truck, and headed out early the next morning. The weather forecast had warned of a massive thunderstorm brewing, but the skies were still clear as I drove deeper into the canyon. The road leading to the house was narrow and winding, lined with thick, towering trees. As I neared the property, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The place had an air of isolation, a sense of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. When I arrived, David was already working on the roof, waving at me as I parked. The house itself was a two-story relic from the early 1900s, complete with peeling paint and broken shutters. But despite its worn-down appearance, it had a certain charm, a ruggedness that made it feel like it had stood the test of time. The land around it was overgrown with wild grasses, and beyond the house was a dense forest that stretched for miles. "Glad you could make it," David called down from the roof, wiping sweat from his brow. "Storm's coming in tonight, so we need to get this roof patched up before it hits." I nodded and got to work. The day passed quickly as we fixed up what we could, boarding windows, reinforcing doors, and checking the generator. The sky gradually darkened as evening approached, thick clouds gathering above the canyon. By the time we finished, the first few raindrops had begun to fall, and the wind had picked up, whistling through the trees like a warning. We retreated inside, just as the rain started in earnest. David lit a fire in the old stone hearth while I unpacked in one of the upstairs rooms. The house creaked and groaned as the wind battered it from all sides, the rain hammering against the windows with increasing force. By the time I came back downstairs, the storm was in full swing. The living room was dimly lit, the fire casting flickering shadows across the worn wooden floors. David had opened a bottle of whiskey, pouring us both a drink as we settled in for the night. "So," I said, taking a sip, "what's it like living out here?" "Must be peaceful," David shrugged. "It is, most of the time. But when the storms come through, it's different." "Different how?" He hesitated, staring into his glass. "I don't know, Han. It's hard to explain. Sometimes I hear things, see things. Could just be my imagination, though." I chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to my laughter. "You're not getting spooked by those old stories, are you?" David shook his head. "No, not really. I mean, I never believed in all that supernatural stuff. But something about this place, I don't know. It gets under your skin." As if on cue, a loud crash of thunder shook the house, rattling the windows. We both jumped, exchanging uneasy glances. The storm was intensifying, the wind howling like a living thing outside. I could hear the trees groaning under the strain, their branches whipping against the house. "Maybe it's the isolation," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Too much time out here, and anyone would start hearing things." David didn't respond. He just stared into the fire, a troubled look on his face. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the thunder rolled constantly, a deep, guttural rumbling that seemed to shake the very earth. Suddenly, The lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The firelight was the only source of illumination, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. David sighed, getting up to check the generator. "I'll be back in a minute," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Make sure the fire doesn't go out," I nodded, watching as he disappeared into the hallway. The house seemed unnaturally quiet now, the only sound the steady crackling of the fire and the relentless pounding of the rain outside. I stood up, pacing around the room, trying to shake the growing sense of unease. As I passed by one of the windows, I thought I saw something move outside. I stopped, squinting through the rain, streaked glass, but the darkness was impenetrable. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just the wind, maybe a tree swaying in the storm. But as I turned away, there it was again, a shadow, moving just beyond the edge of the yard. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't a trick of the light. Something or someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it out the window, but the beam barely cut through the rain. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few feet of the yard. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking slightly. David returned a few minutes later, shaking his head. "Generator's dead," he said, wiping rain from his face. "We'll have to wait for the storm to pass." I didn't mention what I thought I saw. Instead, I tried to focus on the fire, on keeping the warmth alive as the temperature in the house began to drop. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling like a banshee, and the house creaked and groaned under the strain. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. David had dozed off in his chair, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails on wood. I tried to ignore it at first, but it persisted, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and followed the sound. It was coming from upstairs, from the hallway near my room. I slowly climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing in the darkness. The scratching grew louder as I approached the door to my room. My heart was pounding in my ears as I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. I pushed the door open, shining the flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the scratching hadn't stopped. It was coming from the walls, from within the walls. I moved closer to the far wall, pressing my ear against the wood. The sound was unmistakable. Something was inside the walls, something alive, clawing its way through the old plaster and wood. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't my imagination. Something was in the house. I ran back downstairs, shaking David awake. "There's something in the walls," I blurted out, my voice shaking with fear. David stared at me, groggy and confused. "What are you talking about?" I heard it, scratching like something was trying to get out. "It's in the walls." David sat up, rubbing his face. "Calm down, man. It's probably just rats or something." "No, it's not rats," I insisted. "I'm telling you, there's something in there." David sighed and stood up, grabbing the flashlight. "Fine, I'll check it out. Show me where you heard it." I led him back upstairs to my room, pointing at the far wall. The scratching had stopped, but I knew what I'd heard. David pressed his ear to the wall, listening intently, but after a few moments, he shook his head. "Nothing," he said, turning to me. "It's just the storm. The wind's making everything creak." I opened my mouth to argue, but before I could speak, there was a loud thud from the attic above us. We both froze, staring at the ceiling. The sound came again, louder this time, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. David and I exchanged a look, and without a word, we both headed for the attic stairs. The air grew colder as we climbed, the narrow staircase creaking under our weight. When we reached the top, David slowly pushed open the attic door. The beam of the flashlight swept across the attic, illuminating old boxes and broken furniture covered in dust. But then it stopped on a large, wooden chest in the corner, the lid slightly ajar. David stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the lid. He lifted it slowly, and as the flashlight shone inside, we both gasped. The chest was filled with old, weathered bones, human bones. We stumbled back, our hearts pounding in our chests. But before we could react, there was a loud crash from behind us. We spun around just in time to see the attic door slam shut, trapping us inside. The wind outside roared louder, and the house shook violently as the storm raged on. But inside the attic, the air was deathly still. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. Something was in there with us. Something that had been waiting in the shadows for years, and now it was awake.